A cat jumping over a corpse. The family curse. Chapter 2. Summary. On a stormy night, a quiet village becomes the stage for terror when a stray black cat leaps over a corpse, unleashing an ancient curse. Soon after, mysterious deaths and gruesome mutilations of animals grip the community in fear. A farmer witnesses a horrifying figure devouring his flock, sparking panic among the villagers. Desperate for answers, a group of young men, led by Mr. Turner, a retired detective, begins investigating. They uncover dark legends of the possessed corpse, a sinister force that animates the dead. As the storm intensifies, the entity grows bolder, claiming lives and spreading dread. Sacred talismans and folklore offer a fragile hope, but the curse proves resilient. The group devises a plan to confront the evil deep in the forest. Battling fear and the supernatural, they use ancient rituals to combat the possessed figure, culminating in a dramatic showdown amidst thunder and lightning. Though they manage to banish the entity, an ominous silhouette lingers in the forest, hinting that the danger is far from over. The story weaves suspense, horror, and folklore into a chilling tale of courage and survival against an ancient, unrelenting evil. Part 1. The storm awakens evil. The storm was a relentless force, battering the remote village with sheets of icy rain and howling winds that seemed to carry whispers from the abyss. Darkness blanketed the settlement, its narrow, muddy paths illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning that clawed across the sky. The towering forest that surrounded the village swayed and groaned, its ancient trees bending reluctantly against the tempest's fury. Inside their homes, the villagers huddled together, seeking refuge not only from the storm but from a growing sense of dread that had settled over the village. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and only the faint glow of candles flickered within the houses. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that played tricks on the mind. "Stay away from the windows," whispered Clara Tinsley, clutching her children close. Her voice trembled, betraying the fear she tried to hide. "And no matter what you hear, don't open the door." Her eldest Sarah nodded, her wide eyes fixed on the flickering flame of the candle. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded beast, and every creak of the old house made them flinch. Clara gripped her rosary tightly, praying silently, though her mind strayed to the stories her grandmother used to tell, stories of storms that brought more than just rain. Far from the warmth and safety of the village, Mr. Crawley, the undertaker, trudged through the sodden earth. His lantern swayed in the wind, casting a weak, unsteady light that barely pierced the rain-soaked darkness. In his arms was a corpse, wrapped tightly in a shroud, its face hidden from view. The deceased, Henry Giles, had been a farmer, a quiet, hard-working man who had succumbed to a sudden and mysterious fever earlier that day. The villagers, fearful of disease, had insisted he be buried immediately, despite the storm. Crawley had reluctantly agreed, though unease gnawed at him. He had buried countless bodies in his years as the undertaker, but tonight felt different. The cemetery lay at the edge of the village, a desolate clearing surrounded by crumbling stone walls and ancient, twisted trees. Crawley's boots squelched in the mud as he made his way toward the grave he had dug earlier that afternoon. The rain hammered against him, soaking him to the bone, and the wind carried eerie sounds that made him glance over his shoulder more than once. "It's just the storm," he muttered to himself, though his grip on the lantern tightened. At last he reached the grave. The open pit gaped like a wound in the earth, water pooling at its edges. Crawley set the body down gently, then began to lower it into the grave, but before he could finish, he froze. A sound, low and guttural, like a growl, cut through the storm. Crawley's heart thudded in his chest as he turned, squinting into the rain. At first he saw nothing. Then, out of the shadows, a black cat emerged. The cat was sleek and silent, its fur glistening with rain. Its yellow eyes glowed unnaturally in the darkness, fixing on Crawley with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It moved closer, its steps impossibly graceful despite the slick mud. "Get out of here," Crawley shouted, waving his shovel at the animal. But the cat didn't flinch. It stopped at the edge of the grave, staring down at the shrouded body. Crawley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The cat leaped into the grave, It landed on the shrouded body, arching its back and letting out a piercing yowl. The sound was unnatural, cutting through the roar of the storm and reverberating in Crawley's ears. Before he could react, the cat leapt out of the grave and disappeared into the shadows, as silently as it had appeared. Crawley stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the encounter. But as he turned back to the grave, his blood ran cold. The shroud was moving. At first it was just a faint twitch, so subtle that Crawley thought he might have imagined it. But then the movements became more pronounced. The shrouded body jerked violently, its limbs twisting and convulsing in ways that no living body ever could. A low, guttural moan escaped from beneath the shroud. Crawley stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening." The corpse sat up. The shroud fell away, revealing Henry's pale, lifeless face. His eyes, now milky and void of life, stared straight ahead. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, exposing teeth stained with decay. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with the dirt and grime that clung to his skin. For a moment, Crawley was too terrified to move. The corpse turned its head slowly, its neck cracking with the effort. Its dead eyes locked onto Crawley, and its grin widened. That was all it took. With a strangled cry, Crawley turned and ran. He stumbled through the mud, his lantern swinging wildly as he sprinted back toward the village. Behind him, he could hear the wet, dragging footsteps of the corpse as it followed. In the village inn, a small group of villagers had gathered to wait out the storm. The room was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, but an air of unease hung heavy. Old Mr. Grayson, the village historian, sat in his usual spot by the fire, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Storms like this bring out the spirits," he muttered, staring into the flames. "Mark my words." "Nonsense," said Thomas, the innkeeper, though his voice lacked conviction. He poured another drink, his hands shaking slightly. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open. Crawley stumbled inside, soaked and trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "It's alive," he gasped, collapsing into a chair. The body it's walking, the villagers stared at him, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. Grayson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What did you see?" he demanded. Crawley told them everything: the black cat, the corpse sitting up, the unnatural grin. By the time he finished, the room was silent. "It's the curse," Grayson said finally. "The curse of the cat. When a black cat leaps over the dead, their soul is trapped. The body becomes something else." Before anyone could respond, a sound cut through the storm, a low, dragging noise, accompanied by heavy, uneven footsteps. The villagers froze. The sound grew louder, closer. Then the door rattled. A pale, skeletal hand pressed against the frosted glass. Someone screamed. Part 2. The Farmyard Horror. The storm showed no mercy as it raged through the night, its relentless fury making sleep nearly impossible for the residents of the small village. The wind howled like a wounded beast, slamming against doors and rattling windows. The rain drummed on rooftops with a force that seemed to threaten to tear them away. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the drenched fields in brief, ghostly flashes. Farmer Adam tossed and turned in his bed, his thick wool blanket offering little comfort against the unease that had settled over him. He was used to storms living on the edge of the forest. They were an almost seasonal occurrence, but this one felt different. It carried an unnatural weight, as though the storm itself was a harbinger of something darker. Adam's unease deepened as the night wore on. The usual sounds of his farm, his cows shifting in their stalls, the ducks softly quacking from their pen, were absent, swallowed by the roar of the storm. Just as he began to drift into an uneasy sleep, a piercing cacophony shattered the night. The ducks were screaming. Adam bolted upright, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before. It wasn't just panic, it was terror, primal and desperate. The cries rose and fell, mingling with the storm's howling winds, and then suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Adam sat frozen for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Then, summoning his courage, he grabbed the lantern hanging by his bedside and lit it with trembling hands. The warm glow did little to steady him, but he forced himself to move. Pulling on his boots and coat, he stepped into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, soaking him instantly and threatening to extinguish his lantern. He held it high, its feeble light barely cutting through the darkness as he trudged toward the duck pen. As he approached, a chilling sight stopped him in his tracks. In the flickering light of his lantern, Adam saw a gaunt figure crouched in the center of the pen. Its back was hunched, its movements jerky and animalistic. The ducks lay in disarray around it, their feathers slick with blood that mingled with the rain-soaked mud. The figure's head dipped low, and Adam watched in horror as it tore into the flesh of one of the birds, its teeth ripping through muscle and sinew with unnatural ferocity. The farmer's breath caught, and he stumbled backward, his boots slipping in the mud. The lantern shook in his hand, its light trembling as much as he was. He tried to call out, to demand the figure leave his property, but no sound came from his throat. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure for a brief, heart-stopping moment. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its bones, its clothes tattered and clinging to its emaciated frame. Blood dripped from its mouth, staining its chin and neck, and its eyes when they turned toward Adam were milky and void of life. Adam's legs finally obeyed his mind's desperate commands. He turned and ran, his lantern swinging wildly as he sprinted back to his house. The storm seemed to swallow his cries for help, the wind and rain drowning his voice as he slammed the door behind him and bolted it shut. Inside, Adam collapsed against the door, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His wife, Martha, rushed down the stairs, her face pale with worry. "What's wrong?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The ducks Adam managed, his words coming out in gasps. There's something out there." Eating them, Martha stared at him, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What do you mean something? Was it an animal?" Adam shook his head. The image of the figure's bloodied face burned into his mind. No. It was a man. Or something that looked like one. Martha's hands flew to her mouth. "You're not making sense, Adam. What are you saying?" "I don't know," he snapped, more out of fear than anger. "But it's out there, and it's not human." The storm raged on through the night, and neither Adam nor Martha dared to venture outside again. The cries of the ducks had not returned, and the silence was almost worse. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent their nerves jangling. When dawn finally broke, the storm had begun to subside. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the wind died down to an occasional gust. Reluctantly, Adam pulled on his coat and boots once more, steeling himself to face whatever lay in the duck pen. Martha stood by the door, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Adam nodded and stepped outside. The morning light was weak and gray, casting long shadows across the muddy yard. He approached the pen slowly, his heart pounding with each step. The sight that greeted him turned his stomach. The ground was littered with the remains of his flock. Blood soaked the mud, mingling with rainwater to form a gruesome tableau. Feathers were scattered everywhere, sticking to the wet ground and clinging to the fence. Most of the ducks were headless, their bodies mangled and torn. Some had been gutted entirely, their entrails spilling out onto the mud. Adam's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, retching. The stench of blood and death was overpowering, mixing with the damp smell of the storm. He stayed there for a moment, trembling, before he forced himself to stand. The pen's gate was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Adam's eyes followed the muddy footprints leading away from the carnage, footprints too large and too human to belong to any predator he knew. The villagers were already murmuring when Adam arrived at the town square, his face pale and his eyes haunted. News of the storm's horrors had spread quickly, and his tale only added to the growing unease. Groups of neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, their voices tense as they whispered about the strange events of the night. First the storm, now this, muttered old Mr. Grayson, shaking his head. "It's a bad omen, I tell you. Something's not right." The whispers soon turned to fear as others came forward with their own stories. Animals missing from their pens, strange noises in the night, and shadows moving where no person should be. The storm had not only brought destruction, it had brought something else, something far worse. Adam stood in the middle of the square, his fist clenched and his voice shaking as he recounted what he had seen. It wasn't an animal, he insisted. It was a man, or something that looked like one. Could it have been a drifter? Someone asked hesitantly. Adam shook his head. No drifter eats ducks alive. The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. All eyes turned to the forest that loomed at the edge of the village, its dark, tangled trees a constant reminder of the unknown. "We need to do something," Martha said, stepping forward. Her voice was firm, but her hands trembled. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever this is to come back." Grayson nodded slowly. "We'll form a group. Search the woods, see if we can find out what's out there." The villagers murmured their agreement, though fear lingered in their eyes. They didn't know what they were dealing with, but one thing was clear: the storm had brought more than just rain. It had awakened something dark. Part 3. The Legend of the Possessed Corpse. The air in the village was thick with fear. Even as the rain tapered off and the clouds began to disperse, the eerie silence that followed felt unnatural. The once lively chatter and daily bustle were replaced by hushed whispers and wary glances. Doors remained locked, and windows were only slightly cracked open for villagers to peer nervously outside. Something had shifted, and the people knew it was more than just the aftermath of the storm. Word of the carnage at Adam's farm spread like wildfire. The gruesome scene, the human-like tracks leading away from the slaughter, and Adam's insistence that it was no animal had sparked panic. Speculation ran rampant, each theory darker than the last. The village square became a gathering place for uneasy conversations, but no one had answers, only more questions. Among the crowd was Mr. Turner, a retired detective who had moved to the village a decade earlier seeking peace after a long, grueling career. He had seen horrors in his line of work, things that had left scars on his mind and heart. But he had hoped this quiet, secluded place would be a sanctuary. Now the unease in the village drew him in like a moth to a flame. He couldn't sit idly by while his neighbors trembled in fear. Turner stood silently at the edge of the square, his sharp eyes scanning the gathered villagers. Their voices overlapped in an indistinct hum, but certain words pricked his attention like thorns, evil, cursed, and not human. His instincts told him that the root of their fear lay in more than the tangible horrors of Adam's farm. As the crowd quieted, old Mr. Grayson began to speak, his voice low and gravelly, carrying an authority that made everyone listen. Grayson was the village historian, a man who seemed to know every tale, every superstition, and every scrap of lore tied to the area. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," Grayson said, his gaze sweeping over the villagers. "There's a story older than any of us here. It's about the possessed corpse." The name alone sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Turner noticed the younger villagers shifting uncomfortably, while the elders exchanged knowing, fearful glances. "What's the possessed corpse?" someone finally asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Grayson leaned forward on his cane, his shadow stretching long in the weak morning light. "It's an ancient curse," he began. "They say that when a black cat leaps over the dead, it disturbs their soul. The spirit cannot move on, and the body becomes something else. A vessel for darkness. It rises, cursed to wander, its soul trapped between this world and the next." The villagers stared at him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. Some muttered that it was just a tale, but others clung to every word, their minds flashing back to the events of the stormy night. Grayson continued, undeterred. "The last time this happened was over a century ago. A traveling merchant died on the outskirts of the forest. They buried him quickly, but a black cat jumped over his grave before the dirt was laid. Days later, his body was seen walking through the village at night. Livestock were slaughtered, people disappeared, and strange sounds echoed in the forest." "Did they stop it?" Turner asked, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. Grayson looked at him gravely. "They say the villagers tracked the corpse and burned it, but not before it had claimed many lives." The crowd erupted into nervous whispers again, But Turner's mind was already turning over the details. The slaughtered ducks, the muddy footprints leading away, and the pale, gaunt figure Adam described all aligned too closely with Grayson's tale to dismiss outright. That evening, Turner decided to visit Adam and Martha to learn more. Their farmhouse sat at the far end of the village, and as Turner approached, he noticed how isolated it felt. The surrounding fields were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of animals absent. He knocked on the door, and it opened a crack, revealing Martha's wary face. "Mr. Turner," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Come in." Quickly inside, Adam sat at the kitchen table, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as Turner entered, his eyes hollow but flickering with hope. "You're here to help?" he asked. Turner nodded. "I need to know everything you saw that night. Every detail, no matter how small." Adam hesitated, but Martha placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He began to recount the events, his voice shaking as he described the gaunt figure crouched among the ducks, its pale skin and milky eyes. He spoke of its jerky, animalistic movements, and the blood dripping from its mouth. Turner listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Adam finished, Turner asked, "And you're certain it wasn't an animal?" "A predator that got in during the storm." Adam shook his head vehemently. "No animal looks like that, and no animal moves like that. It was wrong." Inhuman. Turner sat back, his mind racing. The description matched Grayson's tale too closely to ignore. "Did you see where it went?" he asked. Adam pointed toward the forest. The tracks led that way. The next morning, Turner gathered a small group of villagers to investigate the forest. Grayson joined them, along with a few younger men armed with axes and lanterns. Though they didn't say it aloud, everyone feared what they might find. The forest was dense, its towering trees forming a canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of wet leaves and mud. Turner led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. It didn't take long to find the tracks. They were deep and deliberate, leading further into the woods. Turner crouched beside them, his brow furrowing. "These aren't the tracks of someone running or fleeing," he said. "Whatever this is, it's moving with purpose." As they followed the trail, the air grew colder, and an oppressive stillness settled over the group. The usual sounds of the forest birds chirping, leaves rustling were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Eventually they came to a clearing. At its center stood an old, crumbling mausoleum, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Few had dared to come this deep into the forest before. Turner stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The tracks led directly to the mausoleum's entrance, where the heavy stone door was slightly ajar. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. Grayson grabbed his arm. "Be careful. If it is what I think it is, you're not dealing with something natural." Turner nodded and pushed the door open. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint stench of decay. He stepped carefully, his lantern casting flickering light over the stone walls and floor. At the far end of the chamber, he saw it. The corpse was slumped against the wall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its pale skin glistened in the lantern light, and its milky eyes stared straight ahead. Blood caked its mouth and hands, and its clothes were torn and stained. Turner's breath caught in his throat. It didn't move, but he felt its presence, a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. He backed away slowly, his instinct screaming at him to leave. Outside, the villagers waited anxiously. When Turner emerged, his face was pale but resolute. "We're dealing with the possessed corpse," he said. "Grayson's story is no tale, it's real." The villagers recoiled in fear, their murmurs growing frantic. Grayson stepped forward, his expression grim. "Then we know what must be done. We burn it," Turner said, his voice steady. Tonight as the sun set, the villagers prepared for the task ahead, their fear tempered by determination. They didn't know if the curse could truly be ended, but they knew one thing: they couldn't allow it to wander any longer. The flames would rise, and with them, the village's hope for salvation. Part 4. The first victim. The storm that had unsettled the village showed no sign of abating. After the chilling events of the past few nights, a heavy gloom blanketed the community. Every whisper of wind, every creak of wood, sent the villagers' hearts racing. Sleep became a rare commodity, replaced by restless hours of staring at bolted doors and flickering candles. A shared dread had taken root, its grip tightening with each passing moment. But nothing could prepare them for the horror that would cement their fears. The morning after the storm reached its peak, the village awoke to blood-curdling screams. The sound tore through the otherwise quiet dawn, drawing people from their homes despite their reluctance to face the unknown. They followed the cries to the edge of the woods, where a small group had gathered around a horrifying sight. At the base of an old oak tree lay the body of Elise Hammond, a young woman known for her gentle nature and quick smile. But there was no kindness left in her now. Her lifeless form was sprawled in the wet grass, her pale skin glistening with rain. Her chest was torn open, and where her heart should have been, there was only a gaping, bloodless cavity. The wound was impossibly clean, as though cut with precision rather than savagery. Elise's face was frozen in an expression of terror, her wide eyes staring at the gray sky above. The villagers recoiled at the sight, some covering their mouths to stifle gasps and cries. Old Mrs. Hensley crossed herself repeatedly, muttering prayers under her breath. A young boy clung to his father's leg, his eyes squeezed shut against the nightmare before him. Mr. Turner arrived shortly after, his expression grim. He pushed through the crowd, crouching beside Elise's body. His experienced eyes took in every detail: the unnatural stillness of her limbs, the way the rain pooled in the cavity where her heart had once been, the absence of blood around the scene. It was as though her life had been stolen away completely, leaving behind an empty shell. "It's starting," muttered old Mr. Grayson, who had hobbled to the scene. His voice trembled, but his words carried weight. "The curse has awakened fully." "What do you mean?" one of the younger men demanded, his voice sharp with panic. "You said the thing would go after animals. Why Elise?" Grayson's gaze was heavy as he looked at the man. "It grows stronger with each act." Animals were just the beginning. The realization spread like wildfire through the crowd, sparking panic. If the curse was escalating, no one was safe. Women clutched their children tighter, and men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. "We need to take her back to the village," Turner said, rising to his feet. His voice was steady, but his mind churned with unease. "We need answers. And we need to prepare." It took 2 men to lift Elise's body onto a makeshift stretcher, their faces pale as they carried her lifeless form back to the village square. The procession moved slowly, the villagers following in silence. The storm's drizzle continued, as though the heavens themselves mourned Elise's fate. Once in the square, the body was placed on a wooden table, under the shelter of the old market awning. Turner and Grayson stood over her, while the villagers formed a wide, fearful circle around them. Grayson produced an ancient, leather-bound book from under his coat. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten text and sketches that hinted at dark and arcane knowledge. "This," Grayson said, holding up the book, "is a record of the last time the curse struck. Everything they learned, everything they tried, it's all here." He flipped through the pages, stopping at a section marked by an old, faded ribbon. The text described the signs of the curse's progression: livestock slaughtered, a corpse rising, and finally, human victims. Grayson pointed to a crude illustration of a figure with a hollow chest, its arms outstretched and its face twisted in agony. "The missing heart," he said, his voice grim. "It's the mark of the curse. The creature, whatever it is, takes the heart to fuel its strength." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "How do we stop it?" Martha, Adam's wife, asked, her voice shaking. Grayson hesitated, his gnarled hands trembling over the pages. "We can slow it," he said at last, "but we must act quickly. Sacred talismans, blessed objects, can keep it at bay. But they are not a cure. They won't destroy it." Turner took charge. "Then we start with protection. Everyone needs a talisman, no exceptions." Grayson nodded and began instructing the villagers on how to create the talismans. Small pieces of parchment were inscribed with protective symbols, and herbs known for their purifying properties, rosemary, sage, and juniper, were tied to them with red string. The villagers worked feverishly, their fear giving them focus as they prepared their defenses. By nightfall, every home in the village had a talisman nailed to its doorframe. Candles were lit in every window, their warm light a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. Parents tucked their children into bed with whispered assurances, though their own hearts were heavy with doubt. As the hours passed, the village seemed to hold its breath. The usual nighttime sounds were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the animals seemed to sense the danger, their pens eerily quiet. Turner sat by his window, his knife resting on the table beside him. He had placed a talisman on every door and window of his home, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. His thoughts drifted to Elise, to the terror frozen on her face, and to the thing that had taken her life. "What are you?" he muttered to himself, his fists clenched. And why now? The answer came with the faint sound of footsteps outside. Turner stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. The sound was slow and deliberate, heavy against the wet ground. He moved to the window, careful not to disturb the curtain, and peered into the darkness. A shadow moved at the edge of his property. It was tall and gaunt, its outline distorted by the flickering light of his candle. Turner's breath caught as the figure paused, its head turning slowly toward his house. For a moment, their eyes met. Even through the dim light, Turner could see the pale, lifeless face of the creature. Its eyes were milky and unseeing, yet they seemed to pierce through him. The figure grinned, revealing blood-stained teeth. Turner stumbled back, his heart racing. He gripped the knife tightly, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do. But before he could act, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. Morning came, but the fear lingered. Word of Turner's encounter spread quickly, adding to the villagers' already fragile nerves. The talismans had protected them, but for how long? And at what cost? Grayson gathered the villagers in the square once more. "This is only the beginning," he warned. "The curse will grow stronger. If we do not stop it, none of us will survive." Turner stood beside him, his jaw set and his eyes hard. "We need to track it. Find it before it finds anyone else." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew he was right. The time for hiding had passed. If they were to survive, they had to confront the darkness head-on. And so, with fear in their hearts but determination in their eyes, they prepared to face the curse. Part 5. The team assembles. The grim events in the village had left its people shaken and desperate. The death of Elise Hammond, her heart torn from her chest, was no longer just a tragedy. It was a chilling confirmation of the curse that had been whispered about for generations. Fear gripped the villagers, and even the protective talismans failed to quell the growing sense of dread. Something had to be done. At the center of it all was Mr. Turner, a retired detective whose years of solving mysteries had never prepared him for the horrors now haunting this once quiet village. His mind churned with possibilities, his instincts pushing him toward action. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't going to stop on its own. The call for help. The village square was silent that morning, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive stillness. Turner stood in the middle of the square, his gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. Fear was etched into every line of their expressions, but beneath the terror, Turner could see something else: anger, frustration, and a spark of resolve. "This thing won't stop unless we stop it," Turner announced, his voice firm but measured. "We've seen what it's capable of. It's growing bolder, stronger. The talismans might keep it out for now, but they're not a solution. We have to find it and end this." His words hung in the air, met first by silence, and then by murmurs of agreement. Yet no one stepped forward. The villagers glanced at each other, hesitant, their fear outweighing their courage. Finally, James, the village blacksmith, broke the silence. "I'll go with you," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "If this thing is out there, it's only a matter of time before it comes for the rest of us. Better to face it head on." His declaration seemed to ignite a spark. Peter, a farmhand known for his quick thinking, stepped forward next. "Count me in," he said. "Whatever this is, it's not going to stop unless we stop it." Lucas, the village carpenter, and Henry, a woodsman with extensive knowledge of the surrounding forest, followed suit. The four young men, each with their own skills and bravery, stood beside Turner, their expressions a mix of determination and fear. The plan. Turner gathered the group in the inn, where they spread out a crude map of the village and surrounding areas. Grayson, the village historian, joined them, providing insights into the curse and its history. "We need to start with the tracks," Turner said, tracing his finger along the path leading from Elise Hammond's body to the edge of the forest. "It's leaving a trail, and that means it has somewhere to go." "Somewhere to hide," Lucas added, his brow furrowed. Grayson nodded gravely. "The forest is vast, but there are places where the curse has been tied before. The abandoned hut deep within the woods. It has a history of its own. If this thing is following patterns from the past, that's where you'll find it." The mention of the hut sent a shiver through the group. It was a place most of them had heard of but never dared to approach. Rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences had kept it shrouded in mystery for years. Turner looked at the young men, gauging their reactions. "We'll prepare for the worst. We'll take weapons, supplies, and enough talismans to cover ourselves. But understand this, if we find it, we don't hesitate. This thing isn't human, and we can't afford to treat it like it is." The group nodded in solemn agreement, their resolve firm despite the weight of what lay ahead. Into the forest. The forest was a different world entirely. The towering trees formed a dense canopy, blocking out much of the sunlight and casting the ground in an eerie, shifting shadow. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint, earthy smell of decay. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional distant rustle of unseen creatures. James led the way, his blacksmith's hammer slung over his shoulder, while Henry stayed close behind, his keen eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Turner kept the group focused, his detective instincts honed on every detail: the bent blades of grass, the broken branches, the faint imprints in the mud. It wasn't long before they found the trail. Deep, deliberate footprints led further into the woods, their size and shape unmistakably human but disturbingly wrong. The tracks were uneven, as though the creature moved with a strange, lurching gait. "Looks like it's dragging something," Henry muttered, pointing to the faint grooves in the mud beside the footprints. "Or someone," Peter said grimly, his grip tightening on the pitchfork he carried. The group pressed on, following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the woods. Even the birds seemed to have fled, leaving only the sound of the group's breathing and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. The abandoned hut. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the trail led them to a clearing. At its center stood the abandoned hut, its weathered wood blackened with age and decay. The structure leaned precariously, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Ivy crawled up its walls, and the windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring out at the intruders. The group stopped at the edge of the clearing, their unease palpable. Turner studied the hut, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "This is it," he said quietly. "It's here. How can you be sure?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Turner pointed to the ground. The tracks led straight to the hut's door, where they vanished into the shadows beyond. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no turning back now. Turner stepped forward, signaling for the others to follow. As they approached the hut, the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Inside the hut, the door creaked loudly as Turner pushed it open, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The interior of the hut was dark, the faint light from their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something fouler rot and decay. The floor was covered in debris, broken furniture, scraps of fabric, and what looked like dried bloodstains. In the far corner of the room stood an old wooden table, its surface cluttered with strange objects: animal bones, melted candles, and a rusted knife. A crude symbol was etched into the tabletop, its jagged lines filled with what appeared to be ash. "What is this place?" Peter asked, his voice trembling. "It's a shrine," Grayson said, his voice low. A place of dark rituals. Turner moved cautiously through the room, his lantern held high. In the center of the floor he found what he had been dreading, a large shallow pit, lined with rocks and filled with ashes. It was a fire pit, but its purpose was far from ordinary. "This is where it feeds," Turner said, his tone grim. "It's been here recently." The ominous discovery. As the group searched the hut, Henry found something near the back wall that made his blood run cold. It was a collection of personal belongings, a locket, a handkerchief, a torn piece of fabric. Each item bore the unmistakable signs of having belonged to the victims. "This isn't just a hiding place," Henry said, holding up the locket. "It's a trophy room." The realization hit the group like a blow. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't just surviving, it was hunting. And it wasn't finished. The vow. The group gathered outside the hut as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into darkness. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. Turner looked at the young men, his expression resolute. "We've seen what it's capable of. If we don't stop it now, it'll keep killing. We have to end this." James nodded, his jaw set. "We're with you." Lucas and Peter exchanged nervous glances but stood firm. Henry gripped his axe tightly, his face pale but determined. Together they made a vow to end the terror that had taken hold of their village, no matter the cost. Part 6. The Shadow and the Storm. The village lay in restless silence, a fragile stillness that felt more oppressive than the storm itself. The talismans nailed to door frames fluttered weakly in the wind, their protective symbols illuminated by flickering candlelight. Inside their homes, families huddled together, their prayers blending with the soft patter of rain and the occasional distant roll of thunder. Fear clung to the air, thick and suffocating. James sat by his window, the flickering glow of a lantern casting shadows across his rugged features. The blacksmith was exhausted, his body aching from the long day's work in the forest with Turner and the others, but his mind refused to let him rest. His hammer lay on the table beside him, its handle worn smooth by years of use. He found comfort in its weight, a reminder of his strength, though tonight, even that felt insufficient. The storm had lessened but hadn't completely passed. The rain fell in a steady drizzle, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint, indistinct sounds. James tried to shake off the unease that prickled at the back of his mind, chalking it up to exhaustion and the grim discoveries of the day. But as he stared out into the dark, something moved. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the swaying branches outside. He blinked and leaned closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The shape remained, a pale figure standing at the edge of his property, motionless against the backdrop of the storm. James's heart began to pound. He reached for his hammer instinctively, gripping it tightly as he strained to make out more details. The figure was tall and gaunt, its silhouette illuminated by a flash of distant lightning. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if its neck couldn't support the weight. Then it stepped closer. The lantern light caught its face, and James recoiled. The figure's skin was pale and bloodless, its features gaunt and stretched, as though the flesh barely clung to the bone. Its eyes were milky and lifeless, but they seemed to pierce through the glass, locking onto James with an intensity that froze him in place. Blood dripped from its mouth, staining its tattered clothing. The hammer slipped from James's grasp, clattering loudly onto the floor. The sound jolted him back to his senses. James stumbled away from the window, his breathing ragged. He wanted to scream, to alert someone, anyone, but his throat felt constricted, as if the figure's gaze had stolen his voice. His legs trembled as he forced himself to look again. The figure was closer now, standing just beyond the talisman nailed to his doorframe. It didn't move like a living thing. Its limbs twitched and jerked, as though controlled by invisible strings. Its mouth curled into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth stained with blood. Then it raised a skeletal hand and placed it against the window. The glass fogged under its touch, the cold seeping through to James's skin. That was when he found his voice. "Help!" he screamed, his voice cutting through the quiet night. "It's here!" His cry shattered the stillness of the village. Doors creaked open, lanterns were lit, and shadows moved as the villagers stirred from their uneasy rest. Turner was among the first to arrive. his knife in hand and his eyes sharp. He found James standing in the center of his home, pale and shaking, his hammer forgotten on the floor. "What happened?" Turner demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. James pointed toward the window, his hand trembling. "It was there," he stammered. "Outside. It was watching me." Turner moved to the window, his eyes scanning the darkened yard. The rain continued to fall, and the talisman on the doorframe swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sign of the figure. Only muddy footprints remained, leading away from the house and disappearing into the shadows beyond. The villagers gathered quickly, their fear palpable. Grayson arrived moments later, his old, leather-bound book tucked under his arm. He examined the footprints and nodded gravely. "It's testing us," he said, his voice heavy with dread. "It knows the talismans are keeping it at bay, but it's growing bolder. It's trying to scare us, divide us." Peter, still clutching his pitchfork, shook his head. "It doesn't need to scare us. We're already terrified. How are we supposed to fight something that can disappear into the night?" "We fight it together," Turner said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "It's trying to break us, but we can't let it. We stick to the plan. We track it down and end this before it grows any stronger." James nodded, though his hands still shook. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice resolute. "But I swear to you, Turner, it wasn't human. Whatever this thing is, it's something else, a growing resolve." The villagers returned to their homes, though sleep remained out of reach for most. The encounter at James's house had confirmed what many had feared: the entity was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. It was watching them, studying them, and testing the limits of their defenses. Turner and the group reconvened at the inn, their expressions grim but determined. Grayson spread his book out on the table, flipping to a page filled with diagrams and notes about the curse. "It's gaining strength with every victim," he said, tracing a finger along the text. "The more fear it sows, the more powerful it becomes. And now that it's fed on human life, it won't stop. Not until we confront it." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "And what happens if we fail? What happens if it's stronger than we are?" Grayson didn't answer immediately. He closed the book and looked each of them in the eye. "If we fail, it won't just destroy this village. It'll keep moving, spreading the curse to others. This isn't just about us. It's about stopping it here, now. Strength and unity." The group spent the rest of the night preparing. Weapons were sharpened, supplies were gathered, and strategies were discussed in hushed tones. Turner took charge, organizing the young men into a coordinated team. James's encounter had shaken them, but it had also solidified their resolve. "We've seen what it can do," Turner said, his voice steady. "But it's not invincible. It has weaknesses, patterns. It feeds on fear, so we don't give it the satisfaction. We stay strong, and we stay together." James nodded, his grip tightening on his hammer. "It won't get the better of me again." Peter and Lucas exchanged determined glances, while Henry silently sharpened his axe. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into something else: anger, defiance, and the will to fight back. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to subside, leaving the village soaked and shrouded in mist. The group stepped out into the gray morning light, their weapons in hand and their hearts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The shadow in the storm had revealed itself, and now they were ready to face it. Part 7. The Forest Confrontation. The rain began again as night fell, steady and persistent, drenching the already soaked village in an unyielding gloom. The sound of raindrops pattering on rooftops and pooling in the muddy streets became a dull, constant backdrop to the fear that gripped the hearts of every villager. But tonight, the fear was not paralyzing, it was fuel for determination. Inside the inn, Turner stood before his small group of volunteers. James, Peter, Lucas, and Henry were seated around the table, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Grayson was there as well, his ancient book spread open before them, its yellowed pages illuminated by the flickering glow of lanterns. Symbols, hastily copied onto scraps of parchment, were stacked neatly in the center of the table. Talismans, newly blessed and bound with red string, hung around each man's neck. "This is it," Turner said, his voice steady but firm. "We've prepared as much as we can. We know the risks, but we also know what's at stake. If we don't stop this thing tonight, it'll keep growing stronger and it'll keep killing." The men nodded solemnly. They had spent hours rehearsing the chants Grayson had translated from his book, their voices fumbling over the archaic words at first but growing steadier with practice. The talismans, infused with protective prayers, were their only shield against the malevolent force that awaited them in the forest. "Stay together," Turner continued. "No one wanders off. No matter what you hear or see, we move as one into the woods." The forest loomed like a living entity, its towering trees swaying ominously in the storm. The path into its depths was slick with mud, the rain obscuring their lantern light and soaking through their clothes. The air was cold and thick, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of decay. The men moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the wet ground. James carried his hammer, Peter gripped a pitchfork, Lucas held a sturdy club, and Henry's axe gleamed in the faint light. Turner led the group, his knife in one hand and a talisman clenched in the other. Grayson walked at the rear, his book tucked under one arm. He muttered the chants under his breath, his voice low and steady, as if to keep the group grounded. The words, ancient and rhythmic, seemed to weave a fragile barrier of protection around them. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting and twisting as if watching their every move. The usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on them like a weight. Occasionally, a distant rustle or crack would send the men's hearts racing, their grips tightening on their weapons. "We're close," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pointed to the ground, where deep, uneven footprints marked the trail. The prints were human in shape but grotesquely distorted, as though the feet that made them were broken or malformed. Turner nodded, his jaw clenched. "Stay alert," the first encounter. The path led them to a clearing bathed in the pale glow of the storm-muted moonlight. At the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Beneath the tree, the ground was blackened and bare, as though life itself had been scorched away. As the men approached, a chilling sound froze them in their tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, faint at first but growing louder and more guttural. It didn't come from one direction, it seemed to echo from all around them, reverberating through the trees. There, Lucas hissed, pointing to the edge of the clearing. A shadow moved, barely visible against the darkness. The figure was hunched and gaunt, its pale skin gleaming wetly in the faint light. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs twitching as if pulled by invisible strings. "Hold your ground," Turner ordered, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Talismans up." The men raised their talismans, clutching them tightly as the figure emerged fully from the shadows. It was humanoid but grotesquely wrong. Its face was skeletal, with sunken cheeks and empty, milky eyes that seemed to glow faintly. Its mouth curled into a grin that was more animal than human, revealing blood-stained teeth. The creature stepped forward, its movements disjointed yet deliberate. The air around it seemed to ripple, carrying with it an icy chill that bit into the men's skin. "The confrontation." Now, Turner shouted. Grayson began to chant, his voice rising above the storm. The ancient words spilled from his lips with a force that seemed to vibrate through the air. The others joined in, their voices shaky but growing stronger with each verse. The creature hissed, its grin twisting into a snarl. It lunged toward the group, but the talismans flared to life, their symbols glowing with a faint, golden light. The creature recoiled, its movements frantic as it clawed at the air. "It's working," Peter shouted, his pitchfork trembling in his hands. But the creature wasn't retreating. It circled them instead, its movements erratic but calculating. It let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that pierced their ears and sent shivers down their spines. "Keep chanting," Grayson yelled, his voice hoarse but unwavering. The men held their ground, the talismans forming a protective barrier around them. The creature lunged again, but this time the light from the talisman struck it like a physical force, throwing it backward. It writhed on the ground, its body contorting in unnatural ways. As the chanting continued, the creature's form began to shift. Its pale skin cracked and blackened, revealing patches of decayed flesh beneath. Its movements grew more frantic, its snarls turning to guttural cries that echoed with pain and rage. The revelation. For a moment the creature lay still, its chest heaving as though it were struggling to breathe. Then, slowly, it raised its head. Its milky eyes locked onto Turner, and it spoke. The voice was faint and rasping, layered with tones that didn't belong to a single being. "You cannot stop me." Turner's blood ran cold, but he refused to falter. He stepped forward, holding his talisman high. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice steady. "This ends tonight." The creature let out another scream, its body convulsing violently. The ground beneath it blackened further, cracks spreading outward like veins. The men's chants grew louder, their voices merging into a single, resonant force. The creature lashed out one final time, but the combined power of the talismans and chants forced it back. With a deafening roar, it collapsed into the earth, its form dissolving into a pool of shadow and ash. Aftermath. The clearing fell silent. The men stood frozen, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. The storm began to ease, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle as the oppressive darkness lifted. Grayson stepped forward, his legs trembling. He knelt by the blackened ground where the creature had fallen, running his fingers over the ash. "It's not gone," he said quietly. "We've weakened it, but the curse isn't broken." Turner nodded, his grip on his knife tightening. "Then we keep going." Until it's finished, the men exchanged weary but determined glances. They had survived the confrontation, but the fight was far from over. The forest had revealed its darkness, and the entity had shown its true form. Yet for all its power, the men had stood their ground. As they began the journey back to the village, the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a faint glow over the forest. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to kindle hope. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. Part 8. The final showdown. The storm raged once more, as though the heavens themselves were in turmoil. Thunder rolled through the darkened sky, shaking the earth beneath the village. Lightning illuminated the trees in brief, blinding flashes, casting fleeting glimpses of the ominous forest where the group had ventured the previous night. The battle with the cursed entity had scarred them all, but it had also steeled their resolve. Tonight they would finish it. Turner stood at the edge of the village square, his face grim and determined. Around him, James, Peter, Lucas, Henry, and Grayson made their final preparations. Weapons were sharpened, talismans secured, and the ancient chants etched into their memories. The air was thick with tension, but the shared purpose among them gave each man strength. "It's weakened," Grayson said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But it's not defeated. The curse won't end until the vessel is destroyed completely. And that means facing it at its strongest." "Then we finish this," Turner replied. He looked at the others, his gaze firm. "No hesitation. No fear. We don't stop until it's over." The men nodded, their faces set with grim determination. Together, they turned toward the forest, where the creature awaited. Into the heart of darkness. The path to the cursed clearing was more treacherous than before. The storm had turned the ground to mud, and the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of mournful spirits. The forest seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting and twisting in ways that defied explanation. Every step forward felt heavier, as though the very air was resisting their presence. The talismans around their necks glowed faintly, their protective symbols reacting to the malevolent energy that permeated the forest. Grayson kept muttering the chants under his breath, a constant rhythmic murmur that seemed to anchor the group amidst the chaos. As they neared the clearing, the air grew colder, biting into their skin despite the warmth of their exertion. The familiar gnarled tree loomed ahead, its skeletal branches reaching toward the sky like a harbinger of death. The ground beneath it was blackened and lifeless, and at its center stood the creature unleashed. The entity was no longer the pale, gaunt figure they had encountered before. It had grown in power and size, its form grotesque and monstrous. Its skin was cracked and charred, as though burned from within, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Blackened veins pulsed beneath its surface, radiating a sickly, greenish aura. It turned toward the group, its movements jerky and unnatural. A guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound that reverberated through the clearing and sent shivers down their spines. "You dare return," it rasped, its voice layered with tones that seemed to come from countless beings. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion." "I am eternal." Turner stepped forward, holding his talisman high. "You're not eternal," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You're an abomination, and we're here to end you." The creature let out a bone-chilling scream, its body convulsing violently. The ground beneath it cracked and splintered, releasing a foul-smelling mist. The storm above intensified, lightning flashing so frequently it seemed to turn the night into day. "The battle begins now," Turner shouted. Grayson began the chant, his voice rising above the storm. The others joined in, their voices shaky at first but growing stronger with each verse. The talismans around their necks glowed brighter, their light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The creature lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. Henry swung his axe, the blade slicing through the air and grazing the entity's arm. It let out a screech, recoiling as the talisman's light seared its flesh. "Keep chanting," Grayson yelled, his voice hoarse but unyielding. The group formed a circle, their talismans raised as they continued the incantation. The creature circled them, its snarls growing louder and more frenzied. It lashed out, its clawed hands striking at the glowing barrier of light. Each time it made contact, the light flared, forcing it back with a hiss. Peter thrust his pitchfork forward, driving the creature away from Lucas, who had stumbled in the mud. "Stay on your feet," Peter shouted, pulling Lucas upright. The chants grew louder, the words reverberating through the clearing with a power that seemed to come from beyond the men themselves. The creature thrashed wildly, its movements growing more erratic as the light from the talismans intensified. Lightning and fire. The storm reached its peak, the sky a chaotic symphony of thunder and lightning. One bolt struck the ancient tree, splitting it in two and igniting the ground beneath it. Flames erupted, casting the clearing in an eerie, flickering light. The creature howled in fury, its form beginning to falter. Its once solid body wavered, flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. Black smoke poured from its wounds, its energy dissipating into the air. Turner seized the moment. He stepped forward, his knife in one hand and his talisman in the other. "This ends now," he shouted, plunging the blade into the creature's chest. The entity let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing violently. The ground beneath them trembled, cracks spreading outward as the creature's form began to dissolve. The chants reached their crescendo, the men's voices united in a final, powerful verse. With one last agonized scream, the creature erupted into a cloud of black mist. The mist swirled violently before dissipating into the air, leaving behind only silence. The aftermath. The storm began to subside, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle. The flames from the tree burned low, casting a warm glow over the clearing. The men stood in stunned silence, their breaths heavy and their bodies trembling with exhaustion. "It's over," Grayson said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." Turner surveyed the clearing, his knife still clenched in his hand. The blackened ground where the creature had stood was still and lifeless, but the oppressive energy that had hung over the forest was gone. The group began their trek back to the village, their steps slow and heavy. Though they had won, the victory felt fragile. The creature was destroyed, but the curse's origins remained a mystery. They couldn't shake the feeling that something darker still lingered, hidden in the shadows. A fragile peace. As they emerged from the forest, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The village, still shrouded in mist, seemed peaceful for the first time in days. The men were greeted with relief and gratitude, but also with the weight of what they had endured. Turner addressed the villagers, his voice firm but weary. "The creature is gone. The curse is broken for now. But we must remain vigilant. Evil doesn't disappear. It waits. The villagers nodded, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They began to rebuild, their lives slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of the storm, the creature, and the courage of the men who faced it would never fade. Turner stood at the edge of the village, gazing back at the forest. The storm had cleared, but the scars it left behind would remain forever. Part 9. Shadows remain. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a drenched and battered village. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, it cast a faint golden glow on the soaked rooftops and muddy streets. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air for days seemed to lift, and for the first time, the villagers felt a fragile sense of relief. The battle was over. The creature had been vanquished. Yet, as the light of the new day crept into every corner of the village, the scars of the ordeal remained vivid. A village in recovery. Turner stood in the village square, his boots caked with mud and his knife still strapped to his side. Around him, the villagers emerged cautiously from their homes, their expressions wary but hopeful. Some carried brooms and buckets, others simply stood and stared at the sky, as though reassuring themselves that the storm was truly gone. James, Peter, Lucas, and Henry huddled nearby, their exhaustion evident in their slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. Despite their weariness, there was a quiet pride in their expressions. They had faced the unimaginable and survived. Old Mr. Grayson was seated on a wooden bench, his ancient book clutched tightly in his lap. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what they had accomplished and what it might mean for the future. "They're looking to you," Turner Grayson said quietly, nodding toward the villagers who now gathered in the square. "They need to hear that it's over." Turner scanned the faces before him. Mothers held their children close. Men stood with arms crossed over their chests, and the elderly leaned on their canes, their gazes filled with questions. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The words of a leader. "It's gone," Turner said, his voice steady but tired. "The creature, the thing that brought death and fear to our village, is no more. We faced it together, and we prevailed. For now, the curse is broken." A murmur of relief swept through the crowd. Some villagers clasped their hands in prayer, while others hugged their loved ones tightly. Yet, amidst the relief, Turner could see the flicker of unease in their eyes. They had lived through too much to believe in a simple ending. For now, someone repeated, the words hanging heavily in the air. It was Lucas, his voice quiet but firm. "You said for now, does that mean it could come back?" Turner hesitated. He wanted to offer the reassurance they so desperately needed, to tell them that they would never have to face such horrors again. But he couldn't, not after what he had seen, not after what still lingered in the forest. "We've weakened it," he said finally. "We've driven it away. But curses like this, they don't simply vanish. We must remain vigilant. We must learn from this and be prepared, should the shadows ever return." The scars of the curse. The villagers dispersed slowly, returning to their homes to clean up the remnants of the storm and begin the process of rebuilding their lives. Yet, the memories of the past days clung to them like a second skin. The farm where Elise Hammond had been found was abandoned now, its once vibrant fields eerily silent. Adam's duck pen remained empty, the bloodstains washed away but the memories indelible. The old market, where the talismans had been distributed, stood as a stark reminder of their collective fear. At the edge of the village, the woods loomed like a dark, impenetrable barrier. Few dared to approach them, and even fewer could bring themselves to look too long into their depths. The forest had become a symbol of the unknown, a place where nightmares dwelled and horrors were born. Turner's unease. As the day wore on, Turner found himself drawn to the edge of the forest. He stood there, his arms crossed and his mind racing. The forest was silent now, the oppressive energy that had radiated from it seemingly gone. Yet there was a weight in the air, an unspoken promise that something still lingered. He scanned the tree line, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of movement. At first there was nothing, just the sway of branches in the gentle breeze. But then, just as he turned to leave, he saw it. A silhouette. It was faint, barely visible among the shadows of the trees. It stood motionless, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. Turner's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the forest. He stood frozen, his hand instinctively going to the talisman around his neck. Was it a trick of the light? His tired mind playing games with him? Or was it something more? A quiet warning. That evening, Turner gathered his team in the inn. The lanterns cast a warm glow, but the atmosphere was heavy. James, Peter, Lucas, and Henry sat quietly, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering unease. Grayson was there too, his book open on the table. "I saw something," Turner began, his voice low. At the edge of the forest, a figure. It didn't move, but it was there. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Peter broke the silence. "You think it's still out there?" Turner nodded slowly. "I don't know what it was, but I do know this: we can't let our guard down. Not yet." Grayson leaned forward, his fingers tracing the symbols on the open page of his book. "The curse may be dormant," he said, "but curses are like seeds. If the conditions are right, they can grow again." "What do we do?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "We can't live like this forever, jumping at every shadow. We don't live in fear," Turner replied firmly. "We live prepared. We strengthen our defenses, keep the talismans, and pass down what we've learned. The creature is gone, but the darkness, it's part of this world. And it always will be the fragile piece." The days that followed were quiet. The villagers resumed their routines, tending to their crops, repairing their homes, and trying to reclaim the peace they had once known. Yet, the scars of the curse remained. The talismans stayed on their doorframes, no longer fluttering in fear but standing as a testament to their survival. Children whispered stories about the storm and the men who had faced a monster in the forest, their young minds unable to fully grasp the gravity of what had happened. Turner continued to patrol the edge of the forest, his eyes always scanning for signs of trouble. The silhouette he had seen haunted his thoughts, a constant reminder that the fight might not be over. The shadows endure. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Turner stood at the edge of the village, looking out at the forest. The trees were dark and still, their secrets hidden beneath the growing night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his talisman, running his thumb over the worn symbols etched into the parchment. He felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that they had faced the darkness and survived. But he also felt something else, a quiet, persistent unease. The shadows in the forest had not disappeared. They had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to rise again. As Turner turned to head back to the village, he cast one last glance at the forest. In the fading light, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of something just beyond the trees. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. But the shadows remained still. With a heavy sigh, Turner walked back to the village. The battle was over, but the war against the unknown would never truly end. For as long as there were shadows, there would be those who braved the light to hold them at bay. This expanded chapter explores the village's fragile recovery, Turner's growing unease, and the lingering presence of the curse, emphasizing that true peace is never guaranteed in a world where darkness waits for its chance to return.